Greetings and salutations, loyal viewers of this channel. My name is Sean, and today we're going to talk about a scandal that has resurfaced as of late because Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, has been attached to Kamala Harris, who is now the Democratic nominee after her successful coup attempt against Joseph R. Biden, the president of the United States, who just days before was saying that he was staying in the race. And this is because it happens to be the largest COVID fraud case that ever occurred during this period of time where all this money was being chucked out the door. And the way that this occurred is entirely rooted in the riots that happened in Minneapolis in tandem with the problems that we saw throughout the whole COVID relief program, because these people ended up using the fact that they had a bunch of Somalis, who are black people, as a cover to prevent any kind of investigating, and that appeared to be good enough for the governor's office, who again, well before the presidential campaign, well before he was the VP, had the blame laid at his feet, and deservedly so. Now, we're going to get into this, but before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay.
Now, you gotta love the way that the Democratic Party works, because you have Tim Walz, who has been put up and hoisted up as this guy who is legit, because look at his military service. 24 years in the National Guard. And of course, that ends up falling apart, not because he didn't serve his country honorably for 24 years, because it turns out in the 25th year, his unit was deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq, I forget which one, and I apologize for that, and he decided that he was going to retire, which angered a bunch of members of his unit, because he then went on as a member of Congress to say that he served and carried weapons of war in combat, which he never did. He left. Again, a perfectly fine and adequate military service record thrown asunder by the fact that this guy wanted to exaggerate. But the other thing that the progressives want to hype about him is that he guaranteed free school lunches to all the little boys and girls in Minnesota. And they put up pictures of him with all the smiling kids, definitely not propaganda at all. And of course, this churns sour because it turns out that feeding the hungry children's actually led to the biggest COVID fraud in the nation during the pandemic, and believe me, we had billions upon billions of dollars in fraud. But in this particular case, this organization that was supposedly going to feed the hungry children's ended up stealing $250 million. At first I thought $250,000 because, that seems like it would make sense, but in the state of Minnesota, they were able to pillage $250 million, which they spent on luxury cars, luxury houses, and definitely 100% not feeding any children.
With nearly 50 people facing federal criminal charges tonight in what investigators call the largest case of COVID fraud yet nationwide. And it allegedly happened right here in Minnesota. The U.S. Attorney for Minnesota says the group Feeding Our Future, led by Amy Bach, stole $250 million of federal COVID money meant to feed children in need.
Now look, you may notice that the woman that they just highlighted in this particular local news segment from a year ago is somebody called Amy Bach. And yes, while she was technically the head of the Feeding Future Foundation, the one that's at the center of this scandal, you might notice that she's a white woman, and I said that part of the way that they covered up this crime is through racism allegations, and yes, that is in fact true, but you need to understand that while some of the heads of these organizations are in fact white, a bunch of the people, of the nearly 50 indicted for this fraud, happen to be Somali immigrants, and this will come into play later, but you need to know that yes, the fraud goes beyond racial lines. It's just at certain points, race was used as a defense in order to deflect criticism, not just because they were feeding these poor minority children, but because they had so many minorities in their organization.
According to the indictment, the group helped others set up fake companies and recruited legitimate restaurants to participate in the scheme. The defendants then allegedly spent that money on real estate, travel, and jewelry. The charges include conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and paying and receiving illegal kickbacks.
These individuals believed that they could steal tens of millions of dollars from a federal child nutrition program by claiming to serve food to needy children when they were not.
Now, of course, you have all your crazy lavish purchases. I'm sure you guys can see the big houses that they're highlighting. There's also sports cars that were repossessed, which I will show you by the feds, by the way, because they were also bought with taxpayer dollars, and these are very high-end sports cars. One of the examples that was actually given to us in a Washington Times article was that one person was paid $7 million for serving nearly 2 million meals, but the problem is, other than the fact that $7 million is outrageous for that, is the fact that she served nowhere near those meals. In fact, they say she served some meals, but it was nowhere near 2 million children being served. Now, of course, a bunch of different reports on this particular matter lay 100% of the blame on Governor Tim Walz's desk. Remember, he was the champion of feeding the children. He posed for that photo, but he ignored sign after sign of these organizations saying that they were out of money being misappropriated, and did not investigate, due in large part to the fact that a bunch of the different vendors and a bunch of the different guilty parties presented themselves as poor, innocent angel Aladdin Somali immigrants, and it would be evil white racism for you to go after them. Again, another effect of the post-George Floyd era.
I've been here for 20 years.
Since moving to Wilmar in 2002, Abdul Qadir Gal has built a life in this city of 20,000.
The kids here and the people here are just regular Minnesotans.
That's why he's so discouraged to learn of Wilmar's connection to the largest COVID-19 fraud case in the U.S.
The good folks that work really hard for a living, and contribute to this community in a very positive way are being dragged in.
Now, I do want to point out in the town of Wilmar, with this specific restaurant that is being highlighted, that the restaurant is not accused of any wrongdoing, but also, incredibly crucially, is the names that you're hearing.
According to the indictment, one of the defendants in the Feeding Our Future scandal approached the owner of a downtown Somali restaurant in October 2020 to see if he would participate as a COVID meal site.
So when we'd heard that this was happening in our community, it really broke our hearts.
As Wilmar Mayor Marv Calvin notes, neither the restaurant nor anyone from his city are accused of wrongdoing.
Do you feel as though one of your local businesses was taken advantage of here?
Absolutely.
Prosecutors accuse Abdikadir Muhammad and his co-conspirators of inflating the number of meals served in Wilmar, reporting 1.6 million in 1 year, while also submitting a, quote, fake list of 2,000 kids who supposedly ate those meals.
Again, they are Islamic names. These were the Somali participants in these particular crimes, and what's absolutely crazy is how long they were able to get away with claiming that they were serving all these different various meals to 2,000 to 3,000 students, when in reality, the real number of students was significantly lower.
But according to the court documents, of those 2,000 names submitted on this list, only 33 matched the names of real students who attended the Wilmar Public Schools.
Through the scheme, prosecutors say the defendants came away with $4 million in federal child nutrition fund.
That's right. 33 kids got meals despite the fact that they had names of 2,000 to 3,000 on their list, which were apparently produced through a random name generator. Again, this is a basic amount of fraud that you can detect. Obviously, there weren't 2,000 to 3,000 people that were kids showing up to this restaurant on a daily basis in order to get these meals, but nobody in Minnesota government wanted to look too much into this, because we cannot dareth disparage the Somali community, even when they're bilking us for the largest COVID fraud in the entire country. This is what the Walz administration decided that they were okay with putting up with. And again, it's embarrassing for the small town. It's embarrassing for the good people in this neighborhood, especially when you see all of these people living the lavish lifestyle, buying mansions, having these luxury cars, again, not leading to any cutting off by the local government or any investigation. The feds had to come in and bust this up because it eventually got too crazy to ignore.
They really exploited the generosity of rural Minnesota. They literally took money from all Americans, and that's a disgrace.
The people of Wilmar also want their good name back.
Look, I'm very glad that the community, the mayor, and everybody is upset about this and they want their good name back, but the fact of the matter is, Tim Walz let this occur. He didn't monitor it. They ignored the warning signs because it was all too virtuous to talk about how he was feeding the children, and he was the governor who was a middle school teacher who definitely wanted the children to get their meals, even if in reality adults were stealing all of this money. Now look, it is one thing for me to highlight the fact fact that they used the cover of the Somali Muslim non-white identity in order to avoid scrutiny for all this time, and that worked for the Walz administration. And for me to just assert that time and time again, show you the different reports that show that Walz ignored that, and you to be able to dismiss that as partisanship, as nonsense, and say, you know what, Sean, you're just stirring up tensions against a VP candidate, and maybe, just maybe, you're talking evil white racism, you evil white racist. But the fact of the matter is, the proof in the pudding is in the taste, and unfortunately there is no pudding because these Somalis stole this money along with these other people who also stole this money. But we do have a bribery scandal of the jurors during the trial with very specific instructions on what the jurors who have been bribed need to do in order to convince other jury members to vote not guilty.
Yet another twist in the Feeding Our Future trial. 2 jurors dismissed in 2 days, all over a bag of cash dropped off, meant to encourage a non-guilty verdict.
So for podcast listeners, you might not be able to see the date on these evidence bags, on these stacks of cash that were collected by the police that were dropped off at this juror's house. But this is all recent information, but information that predates Walz's selection to the VP ticket, which of course happened last week. This is from June 2nd, according to the evidence bags of 2024. And this, even though it was a bribe directed at one juror with very specific instructions that we're going to highlight, ended up actually leading to the dismissal of another juror because he ended up hearing about the bribery attempt. And obviously we try to give people a fair trial in the United States of America, and that would ultimately end up skewing their ability to actually engage in this particular case. Because spoiler alert, guilty people tend to bribe jurors with stacks of cash dropped off at their house. On top of that, I just want to point out that these criminal defendants who stole, according to the investigators, about $250 million from the COVID relief funds still have enough cash on hand to drop off $20K to bribe a juror.
Well, bombshell details in the alleged bribery scheme targeting a juror in the first trial for the Feeding Our Future fraud scheme. The feds today charging 5 people in connection to the $120,000 bribe and detailing how they believe these defendants targeted and tracked that juror.
So first of all, I just want to give you guys a quick apology. For some reason, I heard the $20,000 part and I didn't hear the $120,000 part. So just take everything I said earlier, multiply it by 6, and yes, it's absolutely that horrible.
Charged are 3 of the Feeding Our Future defendants, Abdi Aziz Farah, his brother Saeed Farah, and Abdi Majid Noor. Also charged are Abdul Karim Farah, another brother, seen here in an evidence photo, and Ladan Ali, recruited to fly in from Seattle, also seen in this evidence photo. Ali's fingerprints were found on the bag used to deliver the bribe. Ali's rental car was seen waiting for juror number 52 to leave after court and then following her. License plate readers found 19 times over 3 days. Ali's car was near the juror's home.
They studied her, followed her, and determined that she would succumb to their scheme.
Now here you see the 7 people on trial for this particular portion of the theft. They were taken into custody because they were the ones who were going to know the identity of the jurors and be able to engage in this bribery. And obviously this is shocking, and a bunch of people have said that they've never seen this in a Minnesota case ever. But that's the thing, these people are precedent-breaking individuals who actually think that their ethnic origin and immigration status makes them above the law and not in some disadvantaged position.
They also found lengthy instructions to the juror on how to convince others to vote not guilty, and it heavily plays on race. We are immigrants, it reads. They don't respect us and care about us.
In the indictment, it alleges that she was targeted for 2 reasons. 1, she was young, and 2, that they believed she was the only juror of color. Yeah.
So they have the evidence, by the way, fingerprints and all this stuff that ties these individuals to this money, to the bags that were dropped off with the $120,000. But I find it amazing that these immigrants have learned to play the race card so effectively, because in their instructions on how they were going to convince the other jurors, and by the way, according to the reporting, this female was the only non-white juror or so-called person of color on the jury, they heavily implied that they needed to play the race card on their behalf, say that they're immigrants, they're victims of society, and essentially try to get a not guilty verdict by proving the evil white racists on the jury were guilty of white guilt. That is the insanity that we are seeing, that we are witnessing in the state of Minnesota, that was allowed, again, according to the reports that came out well before the governor was the VP pick, to go on unchallenged by his office and their complete failure of oversight. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think about this whole story down in the comments below. If you liked this video, then show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the largest fraud in COVID funds in America, which was let happen by Governor Walz. Till next time.